and I'll help. Sorry.
I'll call you tomorrow.
Okay, I think we're going to get started here. We have the honor of having Dr. Lee Pelton come speak with us. We have been at Sisterhood Temple Beth David. We have been doing a series on racial inequality. We started in the fall. And as soon as we started on this theme, as a result of events that happened a year ago, it occurred to me that Dr. Pelton would be an excellent person to come speak to us, especially after I read his essay last summer, America is in Fire. And lo and behold, I contacted Dr. Pelton and he graciously agreed to speak with our group. So I'm going to let him take over from here. I have everybody muted so that he can have full attention, no distractions. He's happy to take questions at the end. If you'd like to have a question, we're going to please put them in the chat and Betty and I will field the questions so we can kind of organize it at the end. So thank you so much for coming to speak with us, and without further ado, we can get started.
Thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I thought I would talk about at least two topics and maybe three if we have time. The first is to give you some background on my essay, America on Fire, which I sent to the Emerson community, but it went viral, as they say, and I think there were 7 to 8 million people around the globe who had access to it. Doesn't mean that 7 or 8 million people read it. It just means that it was in their social media, one of their social media platforms. And then I want to talk about the difference between equity and equality. You hear a lot these days. You'll hear that word used very often, equity. I have discovered that not all of us have a very common understanding of what equity means, often it's equated with or seem to be approximate to equality. But equity and equality are two very different concepts. So let me tell you a bit about the genesis of America on Fire. I think it was 3 or 4 days, well, after George Floyd's death. I think it was on the 25th, it was on a holiday. I was deeply disturbed by what I had heard and clips of some videos. But I had not seen, the 9-minute and 46-second video that is now at the center of police officer Derek Chauvin's trial. It was a very busy week for me, and I must tell you, I was weary made weary by what had occurred. And I did not want to write a kind of pro forma response that that I expected some of my colleagues to write, and some of them did, and actually were rebuked by their communities, and they had to write a different kind of response. Um, but I didn't, I didn't want to write the, uh, uh, that kind of essay. Um, but I didn't know what I wanted to write. On Friday night, this was the Friday succeeding the death of George Floyd. I stayed up late and I watched the um, tape of Detective Chauvin on his neck over and over again. I think I must have watched it 10 to 12 times, maybe even more. And well into the early part of the day. It was past midnight, and I was still watching it. And I also saw on various news outlets um, the eruptions in cities across the nation. And many of those cities were on fire. Um, and so that Saturday, I woke up tired, and it was a struggle for me to write, to write anything, because I did not want to write the sort of feel good, um, uh, you know, uh, letter that was expected of me. And that's very much expected of me at Emerson, that I will speak out on these issues, because I didn't feel good and I wasn't feeling charitable at that moment. Um, and so I consulted with my children about this. Consulted with a friend in New York and told him that I was deeply conflicted, that I needed to say something, but I wasn't sure um, whether or not I should or if I could. Um, and then during the day, I received several. Uh, there were form letters or form emails uh, from white progressive undergraduates, um, taking me to task because I hadn't written a note to the community yet. And uh, I was very upset by that, because my view was that I was invisible to these students. I was visible as a college president, but I was not visible as a Black man in America. And so, in some respects, in some respects, I saw that as an issue among many white Americans, that Black people were invisible. Um, and um, I'll come back. I'll come back to that, because in some respects, this letter that I wrote was written to those students. I wanted to do um, three things. I wanted to make the invisible visible. That is to say, I wanted to lift up the what had happened with George Floyd. It's not new, and it was not new. There will be other George Floyds after that. But I wanted to try to um, articulate what had actually occurred, what had actually killed George Floyd. And there were three things from my point of view. It was his invisibility. He was not seen, uh, so he was invisible in a profound sense to the police officer. It was the dehumanization of him by that officer, which I found very troubling and upsetting. As I looked at that tape, it was hard for me to believe what I saw. He kept his knee on his neck until he cried out for his mama, and then shortly later lost consciousness. And even after that, he still exerted pressure on his neck for a couple of minutes. And what allowed him to do that, I think, is because he didn't really see him as human. And African Americans, and particularly African American men in America, are often seen in this way. And we are seen as a threat, a physical threat, not only to police officers, but to many Americans. And then it was also clear that George Floyd died because of years of structural racism, and that structural racism was almost in the molecules of Officer Chauvin. He, if you recall, he had his hand in his left pocket, casual and looking around, if in plain sight, as if what he had done was in fact something that he could do with impunity. And I was struck by that. And so the invisibility, the dehumanization, the structural racism, it conjured up for the Black male, this American view of the Black male as savage and as dangerous and as not fully human. And so I ended the piece by saying, this is not a Black problem. This is a white problem. And until you understand that, we will have to suffer these issues again and again and again. And then I asked the question, well, what will you do in your life? And that paragraph I took from something that I wrote to a student. And I said, I am George Floyd, and you don't see me. And your inability to see me as human is in fact part of the American problem. And so what are you going to do? Don't ask me what I'm going to do. What are you going to do? And I left it at that. So that was the genesis of that. I want to talk about, again, I said the difference between equity and equality. And one of the earliest articulations delineating the difference between the two was a commencement address at Howard University on June 4th, 1965, by Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the title of his, now very famous talk, commencement address, was to fulfill those rights. And in it, he articulates the social and economic structures that undergird racial inequities in our country. And this was against the background of the Selma to Montgomery marches in that same year that led to the Voting Rights Act. So here in this talk, he's talking about the Voting Rights Act and extending those to many disenfranchised people of color. As you will recall, the marches were organized by nonviolent activists to demonstrate the desire of African American citizens to exercise their constitutional right to vote in defiance of the Southern segregationists. And so that the Selma to Montgomery March was part of a series of civil rights protests that occurred in Alabama. And I think all of us are aware of or will have seen images from those events on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, in which the marchers, peaceful marchers, were brutally beaten. And even John Lewis was beaten within an inch of his life and suffered, was in the hospital for several days, and his head was literally cracked open from the batons of the state troopers who were there. But this was an event that galvanized the nation and raised awareness of the difficulties faced by Black voters and the need for a national Voting Rights Act. And this was in fact voted in 1965. And this is what LBJ, a Texas Southerner, had to say. He said the Voting Rights Bill will be the latest and among the most important in a long series of victories. But this victory, as Winston Churchill said of another triumph for freedom, is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And that beginning is freedom. And the barriers to that freedom are tumbling down. Freedom is the right to share fully and equally in American society, to vote, to hold a job, to enter a public place, to go to school. It is the right to be treated in every part of our national life as a person equal in dignity and promise to all others. And then he says, but freedom is not enough. And he could have actually said, but equality is not enough. He goes on to say, you do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now you're free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. And as you can see here, he's now talking about what we refer to as equity. It's about opportunity. So he goes on to say, thus it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. It's not enough to just open the gates of opportunity. All of our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. This is the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. And again, here he could say, we seek not just equality, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability. Not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. And we would say today, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equity as a fact and equity as a result. So to this end, what he is saying is that equal opportunity is essential. But in fact, he says to this end, equal opportunity is essential, but not enough. Not enough. Men and women of all races are born with the same range of abilities, but ability is not just the product of birth. Ability is stretched or stunted by the family that you live with, the neighborhood you live in, by the school you go to, and the poverty or richness of your surroundings. It is the product of 100 unseen forces playing upon the little infant, the child, and finally, the man. So what he's talking about here is equity. And this distinction between equity and equality is an important one. For example, if we're talking about school funding, advocating for equality would mean ensuring that all schools had the same amount of resources per pupil. No doubt this would be an improvement in most cases. On the other hand, advocating for equity would mean recognizing that some schools, like those serving students in lower income communities of color, or even in lower income white communities, will actually need more resources. And will need more resources. And for instance, those resources would be, additional funding, experienced teachers, relevant curriculum, and so on. If we're going to make a dent in the educational disparities that have become to be known as the achievement gap. However, I think, and you hear this phrase a lot, the achievement, the K through 12 achievement gap. It should actually be termed the opportunity gap, because as Johnson suggests, the problem is not in the ability of students, but in the disparate opportunities they are afforded. It is rooted in a history of oppression, from colonialization and slavery to separate but equal, to redlining. It's sustained by systemic racism and the country's ever-growing economic inequality. And more recently, I would argue that it's seen in all of the states now who are seeking really to eviscerate the 1965 Voting Rights Act by limiting access to the ballot in a way that will disproportionately impact folks of color. So we all of us, we talk about diversity and inclusion. We say to ourselves and to anyone who will listen that diversity leads to inclusion when people are able to bring their full selves to learn, to create, to innovate, to work with one another at the highest levels of performance. I believe in diversity and all of its forms as a central, perhaps a defining feature of our aspirations for excellence and as a defining feature of America. But when I think about diversity, I have to ask myself these sort of difficult questions. Is it to level the playing field? Is it to achieve fairness and impartiality, or something else, something beyond being fair and impartial? Is it to promote equality and status rights and opportunities? And if so, how is it possible to create equality through impartiality and fairness if the conditions that created the inequality that you seek to fix still exist? Some of you have probably seen a graphic of three children, one very tall, one middle, and then one very short. And all three of them are trying to peer over a fence to watch a baseball game. And the tallest person, he can clearly without being on his tiptoes. He can see over the fence. He can see the baseball game. The person of middle height um, might be able to see the baseball game, if he strains, but still can't see it. And the shortest can't see it at all. And so equality would mean to give all of them, let's say, three crates of equal height. That's equality. It's an input. And the tallest person will be able to see over the fence quite easily. The person of middle height may at that point be able to see over the fence. He may have to, or she may have to stand on, their tiptoes. The shortest person on the crates that are equal for each of them still cannot see. And so equity would, instead of giving them equal crates to stand on, would give them crates that would allow all three of them to see over that fence to the game. So it would allow all three of them to have equal opportunity. And in this case, the shortest person would have the tallest crate. The tall person may not even need a crate at all. And the middle person would have one that would allow him to see over the crate, to see the baseball game. And this is why, as I said, it's a misnomer to call this, the K through 12. We talk about the K through 12 achievement gap. It's a K through 12 opportunity gap, because different individuals in different communities have less opportunity to achieve at the highest levels. And then when you think about the language of diversity and inclusion and equity, they ask very different questions. And as someone has said, that a truly, and I'm quoting here, a truly democratic education must not be ideologically neutral. Rather, it must ardently pursue the preparation of students for engaged citizenship in an ostensibly democratic society. And whether leaders will gather the institutional will and the moral and ethical courage to provoke and institute real substantive institutional transformation is unknown. And it is that transformation that LBJ was referring to in his 1965 address. So diversity and inclusion, equity, social justice, they ask different questions. So diversity asks, well, who is in the room? Equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure? Let me say that again. Diversity asks, who is in the room? Equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure? Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? Justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority? Diversity asks, how many more of, and pick any group, do we have this year than last? And equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as a perpetual majority here? Inclusion asks, Is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? But justice and social justice asks, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining dehumanizing views? And this is one relevant to my experience um, and as a college administrator. So diversity asks, isn't it separatist to provide funding for safe spaces and separate student centers? And equity answers, what are people experiencing on campus that they don't feel safe when isolated and separated from others like themselves? So as you can see in these questions, equality is about equal inputs. Equity is about equal outputs or equal opportunity. You've heard a lot these days about, you've heard this phrase, structural and systemic racism. And I think oftentimes we conflate that with racism and bigotry, or there's some sense that when we use this term structural or systemic racism, what it means is just sort of racism, bigotry piled on top of more racism and bigotry. And that is not what it means. Racism and bigotry, as we know, refers to personal acts or beliefs or attitudes. But when we talk about structural racism, we're talking about the systemic barriers that prevent some of our population from full participation in this evolving grand experiment we call American democracy. Now, the use of this phrase, structural racism, is often problematic because oftentimes people, especially white people, when they hear this, think that it's a blanket indictment against with all the white people in America because they're racist. And unfortunately, I think that's what's often felt, but that is not how the term is used. As I said, it's the systemic barriers that prevent some portions of our population from full participation in American democracy. And these structural inequities are invisible to most Americans. It's what you, the process that the nation, for at least parts of the nation, are undertaking recently is to make those structural barriers, visible. Voter suppression is systemic racism. Redlining was put into place to sort of curtail and sort of affect folks of color. And it goes on and on and on. I could talk about lending practices in the 40s and 50s, and things that led to segregated housing and so on. One of the things that's being discussed widely these days is what you will hear as the wealth gap. And in 2015, the Boston Federal Bank issued a report called "The Color of Wealth in Boston." And what it says is that the widening wealth gap in the US is a worrisome sign that millions of families nationwide do not have enough in assets to offer better opportunities for future generations. And remember, we're talking about wealth, not income. because income is a flow that provides a snapshot of a family's resources at a given point in time. Wealth reflects the stock that a family accumulates over the long term. Whereas income helps families to cover their current needs, wealth allows them to make investments in homes, in education, and in business creation. It provides safety during times of family crisis or economic insecurity, such as during a stretch of unemployment or when a family member faces a serious illness. Without being able to draw upon assets such as a savings account, a head of household must pay for his or her family's financial needs from current or future income, that is by borrowing money, which for many in the United States is often insufficient to cover large and critically important unexpected expenses. So the wealth gap, the wealth accumulation, is vastly unequal in the United States. And I think some of you may, and I should also say that wealth is transmitted intergenerationally, with the few who own wealth bequeathing inheritances and house down payments to their children, which serves to perpetuate inequality in wealth and impede social mobility for those who are not similarly advantaged. And what we know is that the accrual of wealth is vastly unequal when race is taken into account. So some of you may recall in that report in 2015 that the wealth gap between white Bostonians and Black Bostonians was immense. The net wealth for white Bostonians was $225,000. For Black Bostonians, it was $8. 6 years, 6 years later, the wealth gap has not grown smaller; it's grown larger. So that number 225 has gone almost to 250. It's 247, whereas Black Bostonians have. When I say this, $8 of net worth on average for Black Bostonians. That's it. And you can see, I think you can see the dramatic differences there. And this gap has grown wider since the Great Recession. And so I'll stop there and just say that when I talk about equity, I know that equity intersects with other parts of human society. It intersects with poverty. MLK at the near, when he talked about his opposition to the war in Vietnam, he said that there were three evils in this country. That's my term. It was poverty, racism, and the war in Vietnam. That all three of those intersect with each other. You cannot talk about the opportunity gap in K through 12 and its racial underpinnings without talking about poverty. They intersect. And equity intersects with LGBTQ plus issues. It obviously intersects with women in our society of any color who have experienced these systemic barriers. So why don't I stop there, and because I see I've gotten us to 40 minutes, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to reiterate for everybody, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat and we will relay them. We do have one question already, which is, how does equity differ from affirmative action? In today's world, action has
Yeah, it's negative connotations, and I understand that, because affirmative action often had attached to it quotas, and here we're not talking about quotas in the job place or any place else. So when we talk about closing the wealth gap, we're talking about really about, as I said, removing the barriers that created that that just incredible difference in accumulated wealth. And there's a whole list of things that one could look at. There are a variety of issues that cascade from the wealth gap. One is in healthcare, and it's documented that Black Americans, by and large, receive sort of unequal health care in this country for a variety of reasons. But that is part of the wealth gap. And it's also been documented that Black Americans, even when they have access to health care, tend to be received and treated differently. But again, I think these are issues that we could, to make it obvious, we could talk about women who've long endured these inequities and still do today at the income level. The curious thing about the wealth gap and income is that income alone, an increase in income alone, does not close the gap. And if you think about it, it is as you move up the income ladder, then you are competing, if you want to think about it that way, with people who have even more wealth. And their wealth has been accumulated over time, that the person who has, the jump in income has not been able to achieve. So that's the difference. We're not talking about quotas here. Affirmative action is not, it's not going to make a comeback in this country. It's how do we, I'm using the phrase du jour, how do we interrogate and then begin to dismantle these structural barriers. I'm going to say something that's so obvious to all of you that it will be obvious, but I will say it. The largest fraction, on average, of wealth for Americans is home ownership. Nothing comes close. There's a book by, I think his name is Rothstein. I forget his first name. He wrote a book called The Color of Law. And he talks about how Black Americans and people of color have been denied opportunities for home ownership legally. Municipalities establishing laws that make it less, to make home ownership less achievable throughout history. It's called The Color of Law. And if you haven't read it, I would suggest that you do. I just and so I'm going to suggest a couple of books for you. I think one of, I guess you're going to, maybe some of you are going to read this. It's called Caste. It's by Wilkerson. I want you to read that book because she's able to talk about what I'm talking about without using the word racism. She talks about it from a structural point of view that is legitimized in India. And some of her discoveries are really shocking, really shocking. So, and then when you finish that book, I would suggest that I've already said this to Linda and Betty and others, that you read a book called The Sum of Us, S-U-M of Us, by Heather McGhee. She talks, what she posits is this, brilliantly, that racism impacts both white Americans and Black Americans. And she uses as her sort of symbol of that is a swimming pool in Montgomery, Alabama. In the 60s and 70s, there was this sort of explosion of municipal parks and the establishments of these swimming pools. And in Montgomery, they were available only to white residents. Black residents said, we pay taxes too. We have a right to swim. What do you think the reaction was with regards to that swimming pool? What did the city do? Does anybody know? They shut it down. They paved it over. So not only did Black residents no longer have access to it, white residents who had enjoyed that benefit, they no longer had it either. And in fact, they shut down the municipal park for a decade or so. And this is how racism impacts all of us. And she gives a lot of examples like that around healthcare and unions and so on and so forth. So I would encourage you to.
We have a few more questions here.
Sorry.
Capitalism is an economic system that promotes competition, and competition promotes inequality. But despite its evil, capitalism sustains society. Can you comment?
I'm not sure if I understand.
Capitalism is an economic system that promotes competition, and competition promotes inequality.
Well, it's not the competition that promotes inequality. And if it is, we can change that. Let me give you an example. This is something that I've said to my, I called a couple of meetings with the presidents of the independent colleges and universities in the Commonwealth. And I said this to them. I said, I bet you when you get up in the morning, the last thing you think about is procurement. You're not thinking about your supply chain. But I said, I want you to think about it and to think about ways in which you can allow, without quotas, in which you can allow, promote minority businesses to participate more vigorously in your procurement activities, so that those businesses, and they're all small businesses, can accumulate wealth. And that wealth will have a profound impact on the communities in which they live and the ecosystem of those communities. So yes, capitalism sustains society, no doubt about it. But different folks have different access to it, is the point.
All right, thank you. Another question, what are ways for us to help work towards equity in our society? Are there ways for us to promote it?
Well, people are doing that, and there's, there are a lot of, and the focus, as I said right now, it principally seems to be on this wealth gap, because, as I said, a lot of the issues around inequity um, um, are related to the wealth gap. I guess for those of you who um, who don't own a business or are not part of a um, some sort of policy organization. I think the best thing that you could do is read as much as you can about this issue, and I would suggest that you read The Color of Wealth, that report. I'm trying to get the feds to renew that report. 2015 is called The Color of Wealth, and I would encourage you to read Caste, and I would encourage you to read The Sum of Us.
Okay. One question is, thank you. The equity in my house is how much of my house I own.
Yeah.
Is ownership an analogy for equity in society?
Well, your home ownership is part of your total equity. Whatever you have in retirement, whatever you have in stock holdings, so on and so forth. That's part of your net worth. I'll give you an example from my own life. So I have a daughter who doesn't make a lot of money, and she's looking for a condo to buy. And as you know, this is a very overheated market, and they're very expensive. Her father is going to make a significant down payment for her so that she can own this condo. I have the resources to do it. And it's an example of the kind of intergenerational transfer of wealth. And I'm at an age where it makes sense for me to do it. And she's at an age where it makes sense for her to receive it. And she's lucky because not everyone, has that capacity. And part of what I'm trying to say here to you is that I'm a Black man, but I also am a Black man of privilege and power, and I understand that. I understand that, and that's why it's better to be talk about inequity and equity, because it intersects with wealth or poverty, and that's how we need to see it. So.
Thank you. How do you think white people can advocate for equity without being performative? I feel like most of the activism I see, especially from the Emerson community, this, by the way, is from our daughter, who is the Emerson student, sometimes come off as incredibly hollow and performative.
Well, I would say that your perspective is shared widely. That's what I would say, and I'll tell you how it appears. How I experience the performance is that when we we had some students advocating for equity, and what I received were dozens, maybe hundreds of emails from students. And they were all form letters. They were all the same. They were all saying the same thing. And or I'll receive petitions. I don't respond to petitions because they don't have, because petitions are performative from my point of view. That doesn't tell me, you know, Sally may have signed on a petition because of reason X, and George reason Y, and, you know, Betty reason, you know, A or B. I mean, I don't know. I have no idea. However, if students were to individually were to take the time, think about the issue, and write me a, you know, a note, their own note, not just simply signing a form letter, then I read it, and those are the ones that I do read. But I, you know, I think that's an example of a kind of performative action, and I don't respond to it because it is performative.
Another question, how can institutions of higher education and foundations, such as the Boston Foundation, help to ensure that Boston youth can attend and graduate from college, given the inequities and inequalities that you have articulated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, well, when I arrived, well, I shouldn't say when I arrived, but TBF is already, you know, doing this, or trying to do this at the K through 12 level, and so I'll certainly be engaged in that, in those activities as well. And you know, we'll be looking at this through the, you know, as I said, the equity lens. Here's something that I believe, that first of all, to address the you know, the opportunity gap, we have to understand that it intersects with poverty, and the lack of wealth, and so we can't, the approach, in my view, has to be holistic. I also believe that the formula going forward will be that we have to have a dedicated partnership between government, private, and nonprofit sector. And it's my hope that I can use the leadership of TBF to bring all three of those components together, and produce hopefully a good, maybe even powerful outcome.
Thank you. In your letter, you said anger, quote, anger is not an emotion. Instead, it's a moral.
Yeah, I think I was quoting James Baldwin, as I recall, and what he meant is that anger properly channeled is not just outrage or emotion, but it's a moral imperative to act, and that's what he meant, and that's what I believe. And someone said that to me, you know, I was trying to figure out, you know, should I write it or not, and this person quoted, I'm pretty sure it was James Baldwin, quoted Baldwin, and he essentially said, you know, you have no choice but to do it. Whereas my son said, you know, Dad, this is not your problem. It's somebody else's problem. You don't have to do it. But in the end, I felt that I didn't have a choice, and I did do it. So.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions? Nobody? I think I got to everybody. So I guess one question I would ask is, what was the effect of your letter? What, did you see any results, or what's the outcome of it?
Well, yes, I did. I'm sure that I answered personally more than 300, maybe 400 emails over a period of 3 weeks. I, I, I have this habit, not a habit, but I have a belief when somebody writes to me, I'm going to write back. And I do that on campus, and students write to me all the time, faculty write to me, parents write to me a lot, and they don't go through some, filter of, bevy of assistants. They come directly to me. So I'll mention two things. One is one of my favorite emails was from a white male in his 70s, maybe even earlier. I mean, maybe even older, but certainly in his 70s. He was retired, made that clear. And essentially said, I get it now. I didn't, but I get it now, having read your letter. I get it. I understand it. And so he started he said, I've set up a GoFund page for Black Lives Matter. I thought, this is wonderful. It's really wonderful. And, I received a lot of emails like that, but his stands out. The other impact is that it allowed Black leaders in Boston to speak up and speak out. It gave them permission to do that, and they did in their workplaces. I know at MGH, a group of leaders who, inspired by that letter, had a kind of teach-in, for, I guess, whoever showed up. It was outside of the MGH building. I guess I forget what the lawn or something like that. And so 200 people were out there talking about this issue. And then I know that subsequent to that, many other Black leaders, business leaders, and others have spoken out on this issue. Marty Meehan, the chancellor, I guess president of the entire UMass system, made that document required reading for all employees and staff.
Wow.
And students and faculty. So, but I've heard from people really around the globe, and I've heard from children in K through 6 settings. One classroom, I could go on and on, but yeah. So I think it had an impact, much greater than I had anticipated, for
Wow.
sure.
Wow. And then you got appointed to a task force by Marty Walsh. Was that after the letter?
Yes. Yeah, it was after the letter. And the task force was, he created a equity office and a chief of equity. And then he created a fundraising arm for equity. That's all been put on hold now because Marty's no longer here, and we'll see what the campaign decides to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm not seeing any more questions here. So I think we can wrap it up. And thank you so very much. You've given us plenty to think about, and we will take those reading suggestions to heart and put them all on our list.
Well, listen, thank all of you for taking time out of this today to spend some time with me. It's been a real pleasure to be with you. And thank you for all the great work that you're doing. It's really quite wonderful. I'm grateful. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, the more we can learn, the better. That's what we're here to do.
Indeed, indeed. So goodbye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Have a good rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
So what'd you think?
I thought he was great.
Good.
Yeah, pretty much what I expected. And he, very articulate man, well-spoken, gave us another book suggestion. We might have to add that into our grouping. Oh, now you're on mute, Linda. Yeah.
That in there, right?
And made us all think a little bit more, you know?
Yep. Yeah, I can take everybody off mute here. Yeah, let's unmute. I could do that, unmute. No. All right, any other comments?
They're still muted, Linda.
I tried to, well, I think they have to unmute. I don't know how to do it for everybody.
Yeah, she can't do it for everybody.
Oh,
She can mute you, but she can't unmute.
They have to unmute individually if you want to say something.
Did.
Yes, Barbara.
I wonder if it would be helpful to us after these wonderful speakers and thoughtful presentations to share core ideas or words or a lexicon to make up something. I mean, we see and hear the terms equity and I don't know, there are a million other things that we can do to formulate it. And I think that, a lot of sisterhood people, have an idea of how to put together something that can be readable, but important. And I think an important thing for the whole temple to receive, just, ideas. I think these are dynamite, wonderful speakers that you've put together. I think it's really the best. I mean, I've seen a long line of programming, but I think these are really, we're in a very challenged time now, more so. And I think that it would be worthwhile to do a kind of teach-in and have, or just, writing to get things out there first, step one, step two. But these are so important. One thing I wanted to ask, but I thought it would take it off, the American Indians. We have taken, America has developed because others are still subjugated, are really, they're poor, they're looked down upon. What does it mean? Do we have to go group by group? So, Jews, yes, we've had things through the history of America. We, the Japanese, the Muslims. So I didn't, what in the world? It becomes gigantic if you have to go group by group and say, mea culpa, we're sorry, and then have a very negative attitude about America. And we don't want that. We're proud of America. We want, people to still come and to be, I don't know. So I think it takes a lot, is all I'm saying. This is not an easy task, but I think it's important that we do something for our membership.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting because that sort of dovetails with the discussion we had at the book club this week about inclusion, and what we can do sort of to become more educated. So I was hoping maybe the rabbi could help facilitate a discussion on that.
I love that book, and we read it. I think, that's a good book, but it's one thing it's dealing with Jewish people looking down on a person who says they're Jewish when
Right.
they're Black.
Right.
So that's like another subset of a subset.
Right.
So so it adds into what we're talking about now, but we have to make some choices or how we should progress.
Yep.
And what about our, houses that are being sold? Should they be, thinking, well, if a Black person comes, are you going to sell it? I mean, it's the age old, it's back to the 40s or the 50s. Haven't we come any farther? And maybe the answer is no.
Yep.
So I'll shut up now. But thank you. It was a wonderful.
And it certainly gives us plenty to discuss and, more ideas about future programs. I mean, you can't do it in just one program.
Right.
And those are all valid points, Barbara. It's so complicated.
Yeah.
We have a Native American speaker coming up next month, and we are. Yes, we do.
Yes. That's right. Dr. I have it here. Bridget Arrow.
Arrow. Mm-hmm.
May 2nd.
But I'm thinking also of, I've read a lot. I'm really obsessed by Indians, American Indians, and the whole kind of history, no matter where they are now, and they're trying to be together. Well, I'm talking too much anyway. So anyhow, I think that's very important. And but how do we also then be proud of America? All of these things are really Debbie Downers.
Yep. Marcia, Lois, you have anything to add?
Nothing, me.
Lois, you have to unmute.
Unmute.
Stay on it? Yeah, I think so. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are now.
Well, I went to the moon with the Torah this morning,
Mm-hmm.
with the Brotherhood.
Yeah.
And I was very happy landing in the place where Lee Pelton took us this afternoon.
Oh, thank you.
I liked everything about him, absolutely everything. And Linda,
Yes.
you are doing such a great job, the both of you.
Thank you.
Our president, vice president, whatever. And I mean, sometimes I'm afraid to open up the chauffeur. I mean, am I going to have any time to do any reading this week? But keep it up.
Yeah, we just keep going,
It's great.
Thank
Like one of the comments, but I'm too shy to make comments sometimes. When they were asking for them, I said, here we are, cooped up and trying to be careful and this and that. And you guys are taking us to the moon with the Torah. I mean, what could be more fun? So just keep us connected. You're doing a great job, both of you. Fabulous.
That's lovely.
So thank you. That's what I have to say. Okay, kiddies.
All right.
I'm going to see what's happening at the golf.
Thank you all for coming.
thank everybody too. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. See
Okay.
you all soon.
Yes, I'm sure. If you guys have anything to say about it, yes. Bye-bye.